everybody's still playing in the playoffs, but well, some people are. Guardians did not make the playoffs, so there's a whole lot of offseason they had to talk about. And, of course, there's a managerial search going on. Nobody better to talk about it with than Zack Meisel Athletic, coming right up.
You are Locked On Guardians, your daily podcast on the Cleveland Guardians, part of the Locked On Podcast Network, your team every day.
Welcome to the show today, everybody. This is Locked On Guardians. I'm your co-host, Justin Lanning. You'll see Jeff Ellis has the night off. Before we get started, I want to move you over to Gametime. Download Gametime app, create an account, use the code LOCKEDONLB for $20 off your first purchase, last-minute tickets, lowest prices guaranteed. And the man joining us doesn't really need an introduction, but we're going to do it anyway. Zack Meisel from The Athletic and the Selby Godcast. If you make Locked On Guardians your first listen or any listen, the Selby Godcast should maybe be your first or second listen, however you want to do it, but you should be listening to them every week, and you should be reading Zack just about every day when there is stuff out. Zack, thank you for joining us and talking about the Terry Francona era.
You got it, Justin. I appreciate it. Yeah, you've been on our podcast. Yeah. This is my first time with you guys.
Yeah, it's a little bit a crossover about a year ago, so probably long overdue to ask you to be over here and tap into some of your expertise. Just a very strange situation. I mean, I know it's been 11 years and, you guys talking to Terry Francona every single year and where this franchise has gone since he was hired. It's a big managerial search, but I feel like so much has changed here from what happened in this organization, prior to him hiring here. Things have been so different from the Manny Acta era, and hopefully the Guardians have learned a ton about the managerial search and all this stuff because, what came before him was a lot of inconsistencies, and there were some highs and lows in this era as well. But what have you learned about just dealing with him every day and kind of what it means or what a major league franchise needs in a manager?
Yeah, it's weird because I feel like things seep into your daily life and maybe you don't even recognize it as it's happening. But when I reflect back and I think about, there are so many times, especially during a baseball season, where I just don't have the bandwidth to think about plans for the off day or where we're going on vacation or, what our son needs to wear to this outing on this day. And I find myself a lot of times in the let's take it one day at a time mindset. And I know that's a baseball thing. And it's a Terry Francona thing where it doesn't matter what happened yesterday. It doesn't matter what's on the horizon tomorrow. I got to focus on today and figure out today. And then we can tackle tomorrow. So I feel like, you start to see like how players buy in, how the coaching staff buys in. And the difference that it's weird because like, I never know how to judge a manager or a coach. An offense struggles and we assume, well, you got to fire the hitting coach. And with managers, we see the tactical decisions in the eighth inning when it's a one-run game and they don't pinch hit or they don't go to this reliever or that reliever. And there's so much more to it. And you see the imprint he made on the organization over the course of 11 years and how some of it isn't even, it's not tangible. It's not something you can quantify, but you recognize it. You know it when you see it. And I think he did that so well. And it's just, regardless of, whether he isn't the tactician he was a few years ago or his health issues and feeling like he wasn't shouldering enough of the burden the last few years, the communication and his mastery of relationships, I think is something that, whether it's baseball or life, it's like you can study that and learn from it. And I think that's what made him so valued, so beloved in this organization and around baseball. I mean, it's like, find me someone who had a quote at any point in the last couple of months that said like, it's Terry Francona, life will go on. No, it's like everybody has a story. Everybody has some way of just some example that he helped them or changed something, or just something he said resonated with them. And I think that the easiest point to make is, he even said it, it's like, when a new manager is introduced, it's a happy press conference. Everyone's optimistic. You show him trying on the jersey for the first time. There's never a second happy press conference, right? And yet he got to go out on his own terms, and Chris Antonetti was holding back tears. And it's just, he's a rare person. And I think his tenure kind of sums that up.
Two good points I want to revisit. You brought up, never knowing how much blame to assign to a manager or a coach. And I feel like that's one of the things I've taken away from the last 11 years or 10 years, whatever it's been, is that, you can't really, I think managers and coaches in general get too much blame when things are going bad, but they also get too much credit when things are going good. And a lot of it just winds up coming down to players. And I feel like sometimes people forget that. And also, like you said, he got to go out on his own terms. I mean, how often do you see a manager last game with the franchise be people handing out T-shirts and people chanting his name at the end? Like, usually it's everybody, he gets fired. And, for all the ups and downs, I mean, obviously they didn't win a World Series, and there were things you could certainly point to that didn't work out the best. But you don't see managers kind of get to write their own ending like that. And I feel like that is super rare. And I don't know, everybody right now wants to, there are people in Tampa Bay who want to fire Kevin Cash. There are people right now, even in Milwaukee, who, they might end up not with Craig Counsell next year, and they might find out that's a bad thing. It's just so very strange. But I do think that's one of the big lessons over the last 10 years, is that, as good as managers can be, they get a lot of credit when things go right, and they get probably too much blame when things go wrong.
Yeah, and I think what made him so unique, and the interesting thing is that, like, I don't think he learned this from anyone specific, but he kind of, as his managerial career went on, it was reaffirmed to him that he was doing this the right way. But the way that he was a shield for the players. He would, if someone screwed up, he was the first one to say, "Put that on me." And it was tough in Philly because, fans were slashing his tires on Fan Appreciation Day. But it did show him that was the right way to do things. And so he didn't care about credit. Did you ever once hear him in 2016, like, thank someone who praised him for the way he used the bullpen? No. He was putting Andrew Miller and Cody Allen and Brian Shaw out there and saying, this is on them. I'm just the idiot with peanut butter on my glasses. So it's cool. I mean, you kind of saw it, like, the fact that he won't even use the word retire because he doesn't want the attention. He didn't want to do the victory lap. He didn't want any of that. He was so uncomfortable that last game in Cleveland. It meant a lot to him, but he was like, his skin was crawling because he doesn't like that spotlight. And I think that's just so rare to have that humility in that position with someone so accomplished. I think that's kind of what makes him unique.
There were so many stories. You brought up the stuff with the peanut butter on the glasses, and it just feels like a lot of that was deflection from what was ever going on. If there was a bigger story, or if he wanted to make someone feel more at ease, it just felt like those were so well timed. You can go back to what he said in spring training. And I kind of wonder too, like, I saw the scooter story pop up. I mean, you said people slashed his tires in Philly. He got his scooter stolen the last week he was in Cleveland. And I remember seeing that story, and I was like, okay, is this a deflection from something? Like, that feels like that tended to be his style in big moments. Did you, pick up on that after a few times those stories would come out? Did you, think, okay, what else am I looking for here?
Yeah, it took me a while to figure that out. Because I don't think every time he was talking about breaking a tooth or, he just wanted you to think that he had the lowest IQ in any room he's ever stepped foot in. And in reality, the opposite is true. He might not be book smart. He might have hurried and filled out true for all 300 questions on a true false test in college so he could rush to the baseball field. But in reality, like, the guy, when it came to knowing how to manage people and how to get through to people and how to get them motivated and wanting to give their best effort for him. Like, the guy was a genius. And so I do think some of those were, I don't even think it was like trying to be deceiving. I think it was just, I really don't want to, like, they're asking me to hype myself up, to pat myself on the back. I don't want to do that. So let's just talk about how I ate 17 hot dogs, or something like that. So but it plays into I mean, he's got a fascinating mind, and there's a lot when you're manager, you're the point person for everything, right? Like, he made an interesting point in the last few weeks where it's like, when the trainer has got an injury update on this player and they need to talk through the rehab program, they're not texting or calling the bench coach at 11 p.m. They're calling the manager. And when the front office is going to call someone up from AAA to replace that injured player, they're not calling the third base coach. They're calling the manager. So you're in so many conversations. You're dealing with so many people. You need to know how everybody is going to react to whatever is going on. And he just knew how to handle that and how to make sure everybody was on the same page. And yeah, I mean, I don't have I have limited experience when it comes to dealing with managers. I've dealt with 2 on a daily basis. I've been around, like Jim Leland and Ron Gardenhire a lot in the past. So like, they were kind of cut from the same cloth. But especially like today's manager, the prototypical 38-year-old analytically minded guy who just retired 4 years ago, like, there are a lot of differences. And, I don't know. It's interesting to hear, because it's like a third of the league has some tie to Francona, the third of the league's managers. And it's interesting to hear them talk about what they've learned from him. And then it's interesting to see people with just such limited experience trying this out for the first time, how different they are. It's like, whoever comes in next, it's going to be really fascinating to see how that dynamic changes.
I didn't realize there was such a Bill Belichick tree of Terry Francona. I knew, Kevin Cash, but I guess I never really sat down to think about how many people he has worked with over the years. All right, we'll continue the conversation here in just a moment, so stick with us on Locked On Guardians. If you're trying to get tickets to that next big event, make sure you browse through the Gametime app. Comedy shows, sporting events, whatever you want to go to. They have deals on tickets right up to the event. And if you're one of those people like me who wants to know where you're sitting before you go anywhere, it doesn't matter what event it is. I always like to know where I'm sitting and what the seat's going to look like. You can also view that on the Gametime app. And when you use the code LOCKEDONLB, you'll get $20 off your first purchase. So download the Gametime app, create an account, use that code LOCKEDONLB for $20 off your first purchase. Terms apply. Download Gametime today. Last minute tickets, lowest prices guaranteed. And there's no Guardians game to listen to, obviously, but you can still use your SiriusXM app to listen to all the playoff action as things get a lot more interesting between Texas and Baltimore and Houston and Minnesota. What are some of your maybe favorite memories, or at least ones that stick to you the most? Like, I mean, I can go through and point out, like, I know, there's so many to write about that maybe somebody should write a book out about this someday. I don't know if that's in any of your plans or anything you can talk about. But I remember going back, the first time I thought about that this era would have been worth writing a book about was, I feel like the Papa Shot thing in Kansas City. Like, that's my first memory. I go back and think, like, wow, this is so different and so unique. I mean, obviously, I think a lot of people still felt like it was kind of surreal that Francona even came to Cleveland, because I remember watching sportscasts back in the day and people were like still questioning, like, is Cleveland really the place that the guy who just broke the curse in Boston wants to be? Like, nobody really understood it. So that was hard to believe in the first place. But I think back to the Papa Shot thing in Kansas City. It was right before the win streak, right? But that was like the first time I thought about this era, like, it might be worth a book.
There was a lot, right? I mean, it was that first season. They win 10 in a row at the end to capture a wild card spot. And think about how many times, I want to be careful here. I don't want to say like they were happy to be there, but in 13, you were playing with house money in that wild card game. No one thought you were going to win 92 games. It was such a drastically more pleasant experience than the Manny Acta era. You had players that like had you believing that they could win games. That was foreign for the previous 6 years and 11 of the previous 12. And then 14 and 15 were disappointments. But again, in 16, given the season they had, 14-game winning streak, you get to the playoffs with a tattered rotation, and it felt like you were playing with house money and you almost win the World Series. Like, there were so many junctures in his tenure where I feel like spirits were high in the fan base. Like last season, again, no one expected you to win 92 games. No one expected you to almost knock off the Yankees and go to the ALCS. It's just, that doesn't happen. Usually it's like, think of his Red Sox era. They end the streak. They end the drought in 2004 after 86 years. The expectation the rest of his tenure, it's World Series or bust. In Cleveland, that's harder to do. And, you know, there were some downturns. There were some disappointing seasons that sort of reset expectations. But it was just, they had a knack for like always exceeding expectations when they were low, and then I guess falling short in the playoffs when you actually had them. So it was just weird because there were like a lot of, you know, you're mentioning the Papa shot, and then I'm thinking like there were so many things in every season that they were a contender that stood out, like that felt so different from previous regimes. You know, the end of the 13 season was crazy. That 16 season on the heels of what the Cavs did too was just, you know, the Andrew Miller trade and then how that all played out over the last couple of months. And then you have no expectations when Carrasco and Salazar get hurt, and then look what they do. He made the playoffs. It was like they had this formula, and it was, all right, let's just follow this, pitch well, get a couple timely hits, and then we'll go home. It felt like they could just snap their fingers and they would win games like that. So that's when you felt like this tenure is different. You know, the 90s, you can't talk about the 90s without mentioning that they didn't win a championship, right? The 95 team was one of the best teams ever to not win one. And then they had their chances in 97. They had their chances in 98 and 99, and they couldn't deliver. So as fun as that run was, it felt like at various points that the Francona era was going to be just as good or even better. You know, 17, the win streak in 17 was unbelievable. And I think the thing that stands out to me about that is how boring it was to cover it, because no one would give you an interesting quote because they were following his one day at a time mantra. They were refusing to look ahead or talk about the history of it all. So there have been a lot of points, I think, to your point, where it just felt like it was going to be an era worth capturing. And, you know, it's crazy. This week is 75 years since their last championship. And I, being a writer and someone who loves a storybook script, thought that, you know, in the 90s, that would have been the perfect cherry on top, right? And in 2016, especially after what the Cavs did, I mean, that was the year of Cleveland, and it didn't work out. So come back in 2017, they had like the best roster maybe since 95. Those might be the two best rosters of the last 75 years, and didn't happen, right? It felt like Terry Francona should be at the helm when they break through, and that's not going to be the case now. And so now it's like, well, what is this even going to look like? You know, it was perfect. LeBron came home and they won the title. What's it going to look like for the Guardians? I don't know, but Terry Francona not being there feels a little weird.
You mentioned the difference in tone, how things changed, like covering the players all following Tito's, you know, mantra, the one game at a time. I remember vaguely. I don't remember. You were obviously there at the end of the Manny Acta era, and I just remember how different the tone was coming out of just reading whatever you guys might have written, covering Manny Acta every day, especially towards the end. You know, after the 5 and 24 month of August, that was probably the worst stretch of baseball in, you know, our lifetime for Cleveland. Just how different the tone was then versus day one with Francona, how much that changed. And it's just so bizarre to see the differences in those eras, but also differences in just dealing with a manager on a day-to-day basis. Like, I'm sure you've learned a lot since then, because one thing I kind of wanted to bring up too was that, we talked about before press conferences, on stuff you don't watch, the post-game press conference. You don't get the 3 minutes. You don't get everything that's being asked there. And I feel like that gets lost on a lot of people. And so I'm just kind of curious to see what you've learned on dealing with a manager, but Francona or anybody. But I mean, I know you've asked some tough questions over this year, and you've had some interesting interactions, and just kind of trying to see what you've learned dealing with him, but also the difference between, like you said, you've only been around two managers every day. It's been Tito or Manny Acta.
Yeah, and everyone's different. Like, I've been in other teams' sessions, and whenever you're filling in for someone like MLB.com, they always have someone filling in if the beat writer doesn't go on a trip or even at home sometimes. And a lot of especially the long tenured MLB.com beat writers will tell the fill-in, don't ask something. Just listen. You don't have to ask anything. Let the people who are there daily ask. And with Francona, it became a running joke. Like, whoever's filling in for Mandy Bell or Jordan Bastion, they never listened. They always asked something. And, when you're not around every day, one, you're not as tuned into like what's going on with the team, why someone's not playing maybe on a particular day, or why they operate in a certain fashion. And you don't know what makes a manager tick. You don't know. Sometimes there's a way to ask a question that's going to get the answer that people want. And it can be different with everybody. I mean, I remember being in with the Phillies one day this year, and like, I don't know Rob Thompson at all. And I was thinking about how I would have asked the opening question in his post-game press conference, and whoever asked it completely different and got the answer that I was hoping I would have gotten. And I'm like, well, thank God I didn't open my mouth. And with Francona, it's a learning process, and he's also, he can be a little prickly to people he doesn't know too, because he doesn't know your angle. You're just trying to get him to say something that you can run with in a headline. So I think, yeah, I mean, the thing that I learned from him that I appreciated was that if we butted heads, like, cooler heads were going to prevail. The next day, there was one time, 2014, maybe 2015, we were in like a shouting match in his office. And I think I was in the wrong there. I was very young at the time and like didn't know if I handled it properly. For like the next week, I didn't say a word. And I finally asked the PR person, I said, like, do you think I'm safe to ask a question? Is he over this? And the PR person said, oh, he was over it the second you walked out of his office. So first of all, they have enough on their plate. I don't think they can care too much about that sort of interaction. But, my point of view is always, I'm just trying to learn about the game. You're the Hall of Fame manager. I'm a reporter who's just trying to represent the fans and relay information to them, ask what they want the answers to. And he knew that. And he would always say, like, I need to be prepared to answer those questions about in-game strategy, or else I'm not doing my job. Like, I need to have supporting evidence for why I did something. I need to have a reason. So because of that, like, and there were certainly times this year where you probably heard in the post-game press conference on TV that we weren't seeing eye to eye on something. And usually the next day or at some point, and then shortly after that, we would have a conversation and hash things out. Maybe I'd get a better explanation or an explanation of, the other thing is these people, like managers, front office, like they lie. They have to lie. Maybe there was a player at some point who was terrified of the spotlight and didn't want to be in, it doesn't matter what sport it is. Maybe there was a basketball player who just didn't want to be in with the game on the line because he was terrified and couldn't handle the pressure, right? And the coach doesn't want to just hang that player out to dry, so they're going to say, well, I just didn't think that was our best rotation. Thought this guy was a better fit at that moment, right? Like, I always say, like, watch what they do, not what they say. And so it's just such a difficult balancing act, because you know that, and you're asking questions that you know they might be lying to you with the answer. So it's up to you to sort of figure it out and filter, and it can create head scratching moments and moments where you're trying to decide how to ask something. And I think the thing with Francona is he knew all of this too. I think that's the difference between some first-time manager who's never been through this, it's different when you talk to the media once in a while and then you talk to the media twice a day, every day for 9 months. So he was really good at making sure his players weren't taking any extra heat, making sure he had their backs, and then finding a way to convey things publicly that, if someone was going to shoulder the blame, it was going to be him.
All good points. And you did a great job covering Tito this entire era. And I think people just Twitter is not always a good gauge of real life or X, whatever we're going to call it. I just always love going back to people like, well, they won't ask Tito the tough questions. And it's like, I wish people really understood the nuances of covering somebody every day and just not seeing everything through a 3-minute clip at the end of a game.
Yeah, and that's the thing, is it's timing is everything too, right? So like the famous clip from this year, I mean, think about the day that took place. Like, they had traded Savali, they were on the verge of trading Bell, and like their season was in shambles. They got no hit the next night. The front office is trying to figure things out. Like, that was the heat of the moment. I mean, it was an important time. Like it felt like the right time to ask that. I don't regret it, but also know that like questions like that, especially with him, like a lot of times the best answers you're going to get are off the record, or they're not 5 minutes after it happened when everybody's emotional about the loss. So you just have to pick your spots. And, I hope that people can trust that, like, I know the right buttons to press and like when to get the information. Because believe me, like, I have the same questions. Everyone is screaming at their TVs about whatever. And like, I'm asking the same thing in the press box as it's happening.
We'll wrap up today's conversation with Zach, and then we'll look ahead to what might be on the plate, who we might be dealing with in terms of a manager coming up in the next few years. And make sure you're listening to the playoffs on your SiriusXM app as far as this thing goes. Whether it's Baltimore, it looks like it's going to be Texas and whoever, and Philadelphia looks really tough. So make sure you're listening to all the playoff action on the XM app. Yeah, it was an interesting era. I mean, I don't know what else to say. Like, it's just so many moments. Like, there were so many highs and lows, and I think you can look at, like, bullpen usage. Like, look what happened to Andrew Miller after things happened here, and you can point at, lineups and, Miles Straw thing, the Tyler Freeman thing, and losing Yandy Diaz, all those things. I think, no manager's perfect. And like you said, they didn't win a World Series. That's going to be a part of the story of the Terry Francona era in Cleveland. But he still got to write his own ending. And I feel like, outside of 2021, I mean, nobody knew what to expect in 2020 after everything that happened. And 2021, no one knew what to expect. I don't think anybody expected 2013. I know they went out and signed Swisher and Bourne, and they made some other additions. No one knew what to expect then. But after 2023, there was always an expectation until things started to get, pieced around, and they did small little rebuilds in 2019, and they still won 93 games in 2019. So for all the things you can pick on, like, how much he might overuse a certain reliever, or the Miles Straw thing, lineups, the Yandy Diaz thing, who knows? A lot more up and down, and you felt like coming into the year, there was always an expectation that this team was going to contend for a playoff spot. And I feel like that's probably why he got to kind of write his own ending, and that's why he kind of got to go out on his terms.
It'll be interesting to see what the feeling is about, like, didn't you always feel like there was a chance they could overachieve, even if you had relatively low expectations going into a season? And I'm curious to see if that exists moving forward.
I mean, I didn't predict 2022.
Right. Yeah, even if I mean,
Yeah,
like 2014 was disappointing, and then going into 2015. So remember, 2014 was the year where they were on the SI cover. They thought they'd win the World Series, and then it didn't happen. And then 2015, like, they didn't really change much. I think they added Brandon Moss, cool, and then, but you still felt like, I don't know, like maybe there's a chance to overachieve. I'll be interested to, with hindsight, to like look back once there's a new manager, and do you still feel that? Was it the Francona effect? Was it just the organization? Was it the players? I don't know.
All be interesting to see. And they're going to have a new manager soon. Who knows how soon they'll announce a new manager, but it's certainly going to be a different world. Zach, we're going to ask you about that on tomorrow's episode of Locked On Guardians. Who do you think the next manager might be, and what's going to go into all this? But in the meantime, whether you listen to Locked On Guardians first or you don't, you should be listening to Selby's Godcast a week. One free episode. You guys do a good job on the paid episode as well. Look, are you still buying people beers? Are we still doing that for the reviews and the getting into the Discord and all that? Are we still doing that?
Yeah, until I run out of money, which might happen soon.
Yeah, inflation's high, but look, the cost of beer is more expensive than it costs to subscribe to Selby's Godcast on Patreon. So Zach is really giving you money to subscribe to Selby's Godcast, and with that money you're saving, you can also sign up for The Athletic and read his stories on the Guardians, because there really is nobody better in Cleveland. I grew up reading, Hal Lebovitz and Jim Ingram, and even though we're close to the same age, I feel like, I read you the same way I read those guys growing up.
It means a lot. I appreciate it. Especially, I feel like I've known you for a long time, even if we haven't always crossed paths a ton. And I mean, believe me, I had the Plain Dealer in my hand every morning as a kid, reading Bud Shaw, Bill Livingston, Paul Hoynes, Terry Pluto. So, yeah, that means a lot.
All good stuff. So yeah, make sure you subscribe to Selby's Godcast Patreon if you're not already. If you're listening to this, you're not already. That's shocking to me, but if you're not, you should be doing that, and you should be signing up for The Athletic as well. So, Zach, thanks for joining us in this episode, and we'll talk to you again when we talk about the next new manager.
Sounds good. Appreciate you guys having me.
Go, Guardians, go.